So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, this 45 minutes, where we're going to be diving into this theme of artificial intelligence for executives. I want to thank you all for dialing in. I'm going to apologize in advance because we're going to have to go really quickly. We're going to cover everything we can possibly think of about AI for execs in 45 minutes. Clearly, that's not going to play out just like that. We've got to allow time for your questions. We're going to go through the high-level themes. We're going to go and pick Dr. Jay Van Zale's brains on this. I'll introduce him in a second. We'll talk about why we're doing this. There's a course that we've set up in partnership with Henley Business School and the Financial Academy in Saudi, which we're very much looking forward to run. And in some ways, we'll be covering the topics that course is actually looking at. That's a 3-day course, and we'll be trying to go and skate over some of those things in 45 minutes or less. What else can I say? Well, let's start with an introduction to Jay so that we know who is going to be our thought leader on this particular topic. And I couldn't think of a better one to bring into the discussion, partly because Jay's been in this field for years. I don't like saying that because it just means that he's particularly old. Back in 2001, he'd already achieved a PhD in innovation and design. And since then, he's really been bringing together this idea of social science and technology and artificial intelligence to go and become what I would call an AI entrepreneur. His latest venture, Ecosystems AI, is all about trying to find easy ways to bring recommender engines and use social and tech engineering to go and influence patterns, influence behaviors, understand your customers. We'll touch on that a little bit as well. Jay spends his time pretty much split 50-50 between the US and South Africa. South Africa's from where he's been from, and obviously if you're in AI, you have to be over in Silicon Valley. He's also working as a faculty member at Henley Business School and California State University. He's authored a number of books, and I could go on and on. If you want to go and know more about Jay, do look him up on LinkedIn. He has got a bio that many would only die for. So with that, Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Colin. Looking forward to the discussion.
Where are you actually dialing from today?
Today I'm in a great city called Johannesburg for another few hours. We'll be leaving here tonight.
Okay, well, let's go and make sure that you get there on time and not hold you up too much. Thank you very much for making the time to join us on this call. Now, when we were talking about artificial intelligence for executives, one of the sort of base cases before we got into this was we feel that there is a demand for this. We feel that executives need to go and get more insight into exactly what's happening here. And I think this speaks to what's happening on the AI landscape just across the globe. Obviously, we've seen it being very popularized over the last year or so. It's gone from literally 0 people knowing anything about it to now 1 billion people still knowing nothing about it, but appreciating it because they're using things like ChatGPT and other large language models. What's your opinion? How important is AI actually to most businesses? Is this still something which is being oversold and underutilized, or is it actually something which is transformational?
I think maybe the way to look at it is that it's been around for a long time and it's been used in isolated pockets. You know, and the winters that AI has been through, all of them had some kind of relationship to the technology, access to data, algorithms, and mostly the compute, power that is needed to get some of these algorithms to do what they need to do. And I think we kind of in a Goldilocks environment at the moment where the access to a lot of these capabilities are now exploding. And alongside that, financial institutions, because they are risk managed, environments, mean that they don't want to just embark on something that is not going to be proven and it's tested. So you'll see that historically financial institutions used machine learning and some of the other pillars within the AI world in credit and in risk and in fraud and a number of different parts of the bank. So it's not like it's been not implemented or used by many. It is just that now that the face of it is changing through conversational and images and various other ways in which you can get an AI to do things for you, that we see that the public is now getting very interested in it. So I think that, the importance will continue to grow exponentially. And the reason is that the intellectual capabilities that humans normally apply in the act of work, especially in a financial institution, can be augmented, not necessarily replaced by this kind of tooling. So you could compete in a space where you were never able to compete previously, because you now have access to tools who can augment some of these skills and assist you to get the job done. So we see that the cases are quite diverse across various pillars within the institutions.
What version of AI do you think we're on? Are we kind of at 1.0 or less than that, or are we on well on our way kind of to reaching some sort of plateau where we don't notice too much benefit going forward?
Well, I think that the thing is, there are a number of views on the singularity, and that means that we're on our journey to kind of replace all human intellectual capacity with some kind of intelligence, artificial or otherwise. And if you had to take it just in its current setting, we look backwards. So that means that we have an ability to take historical data and take evidence of all the actions that humans have taken prior to the current time. And a large portion of this discipline is kind of designed around using existing or prior evidence of human activity to attempt to predict the future. So that means that I think that field will continue, and a lot of the current language models, so that means generative models, discriminative-based models, or even statistical-based models, all of those really rely on the fact that the situation that you're in stays stable, right? So that means that you look backwards. But what we're seeing is that as soon as you look the other way and you start saying, well, how can these models be designed? Are the current architectures sufficient for us to predict a future? And especially in a world of dynamic complexity and a world of complex societal drivers, we need to have a slightly different view of how we do that. And I think that in that view, or from that viewpoint, we're probably at 1.0. We are showing the capability to take human intellectual output, linguistic and other outputs, digitizing it, and using that for a machine to artificially construct something that we call intelligence. And I think that the unfortunate intersection between neurosciences and the human sciences and AI is that we believe, or some people believe, that they do have a clear definition of the word intelligence. So at the moment, that framework is used to say, well, and let's take an example of this. If I have a chatbot speaking back to me because I ask it some questions and it sounds like me, humans love to compare themselves to other things that look like themselves. So that means I go, wow, this thing really understands me, but it doesn't actually, because the architecture is a probabilistic, it's mathematics. There's very little in there around an understanding of the human itself. We're moving into a world now where by the time we take protein data sets, DNA data sets, and other data sets, and we bring those into the fold of learning models, I think we're at the beginning of that revolution. In the old revolution, we're probably in the third wave, because there's been three distinct, if you think about the winters that happened historically from the 50s onwards, all the way through to the 80s, there were a few dips. And now that we have access to a lot of the compute, the generative world basically taught us that humans are deeply excited about novelty. They want things to be specific to what they ask them, and it must look like it is just for them, personalized, without looking at a screen or using any other kind of touch point. Yeah, maybe that's the way to look at it.
Well, another way to look at it, I'm going to see what views you've got on this. I'll try to describe it carefully. I was watching Mustafa Suleyman. I've read his book recently. I recommend it for everyone. If you don't know who he is, he was the co-founder of DeepMind. He's now the Microsoft AI CEO. He's written this fantastic book. He's just done a TED Talk recently. He also did Inflection AI, so your personal AI assistant. A very knowledgeable guy, very worth listening to. He has come out and used a metaphor and suggested that AI is effectively a new digital species, something which didn't previously exist. And back to what you said earlier in terms of it just mathematical and stats and ones and zeros, he said, well, applying that to this type of AI as an idea is a bit like saying humans are just bits of carbon and water.
Exactly.
Okay, it doesn't really cover the impact of what AI is bringing. And he goes on to talk about how the fact that obviously if you can ingest billions and billions of words and books, which a single human would take thousands, hundreds of thousands of years to do, being able to act human and feel human and be human is exactly where we're going in terms of AI, and then you're reaching this point of singularity. Is that kind of an idea that you ascribe to, and does it worry you in any sort of way, shape, or form?
I think that the way that we look at it in a large portion of my life is about behavioral sciences and the field of computational social science. That basically means that the only way that you know that you can learn about a human's actions is by studying the evidence they leave behind.
Yeah.
So that means that you don't speak to them because humans, have got a way of describing things, ambiguously, and they often, twist the truth, and there are various ways in which they kind of communicate things. So that means that the perfection of the human biological system lies in its error. It lies in its ability to become motivated, and it's got an ability to have nostalgia. It knows how it has changed over time, and every time that it goes through a change, it's got a very complex forgetfulness activation function.
Mm.
And the entire deep learning world, an AI world, is built on an activation function that's got to do with learning, not forgetting. And we forget about that. And that means that if we take a very, very simple example, a human that has experienced a hardship and they want to overcome it, how do they overcome it? They contextually program themselves to selectively forget events, situations, people, language, and they can live a pretty full life if they conquer that. In an AI, there is no equivalent architecture at the moment. There are many companies working on it, and we ourselves are working on some of that research to find out how do you contextually forget and remember the things that are or not important based on the situation that you are in. So I
Yeah.
think that the current AI architecture does not cater for that. So we need to come up with an organism style architecture that can take into account a sense of this dynamic, complex, decision making that normally goes on in the human's neural system to help define its outcome. And I think the thing is that, does it scare me? I'm not sure, because if I look at historically, let's look at the discovery of penicillin, how that's transformed human existence. I mean,
Mm.
you would have died from an infection in your toe or a throat infection if you did not have access to it if you lived 200 years ago. So that means that every generation had inventions that augmented the human's ability to achieve greater outcomes. And I think that the more we focus on this, the more it will get better outcomes. Within the last few days, the CRISPR community, that is essentially the biohacking community, are
Yeah.
already creating ways in which you can fold proteins in a way that you can find correlations between DNA and certain actions or certain illnesses that has gone through the roof. And by the time those data sets get published and they get access, we're going to get the large gene model, the large protein model. And that means that many people will be able to perform many of these actions themselves and even augment their own capabilities, maybe. So I'm not sure if I agree or not agree yet, if that is the way to go. But I know that if I had a family member that I could genetically alter to keep them around for a bit longer, I'm sure that I will make that decision.
Well, it was a tough question to give you in a 45-minute call. Let's bring a bit more relevance
Sure.
into it. So, what's going to happen
Yeah.
in the world where many of the audience are, and people that will watch the recording, in terms of financial services? I'm going to use a specific example. We can look at some use cases now, and I'm really trying to unpack through a couple of questions, how important it is for institutions to grab hold of this technology. And my first example is really a couple of weeks ago, where Klarna, so a buy now pay later platform, probably the biggest in the world in that space, have announced very proudly, which I'm not sure how their HR department felt about this, that they've been able to implement AI for their call centers using bots. They estimate it saved 700 headcount and
Yeah.
improved their bottom line, their P&L, by $40 million. Now, when you go and extrapolate that and think about your typical use case, in an institution or institutions in finance, which is all about ones and zeros and data, it's a services industry. It feels like the number one use case is going to lead, unfortunately, to massive reductions in the number of headcount you need in those organizations, because we're going to be able to automate virtually everything. Is that a fair hypothesis of where things are going, and how critical is it that the CEOs and business leaders start looking at this?
Yeah, I definitely think that is a fair hypothesis, but I think the way that you need to kind of look at this is that if you had to take the perfect world of the financial institution, should a customer have to contact you at all? Is the kind of higher level question you might want to consider. That means that every interaction with a human that deals with solving a problem means that it is something in your business system that you have not been able to figure out yourself or be able to automate or drive through your digital strategy. So that means that if you take then the flip side of the story, does that then mean that if I think about a human contacting me, and let's think of the Klarna or other scenarios where people contact centers, is the purpose of you contacting the contact center to speak to a human? Or is the purpose of you contacting the contact center to get a problem solved and a solution immediately and as quickly as possible? And I think that is what most people in this space forget, is that you could, if you know the consistency of problems coming in, then you could easily automate, and you can use generative AI that you probably never want to have dynamic generation publicly anyway because of hallucination and other challenges. But you can rethink the approach. How we look at it is that I think that executives need to consider this as an holistic problem. They need to think of it systemically. So if you think of, we often use the construct called, making money, saving money, and protecting money. In a Klarna scenario, it's got to do with saving money. In the making money, if I want to drive, let's say I know nothing about you, and I want to drive a campaign to onboard you, and I want to drive a campaign to make you aware, things that I'm going to get are maybe some historical data points and maybe the time of the day and other things that I'm going to be using to convince you to come sign up with me or to participate with me. Once you participate with me, I then need to activate you. So that means that I need to convince you to participate in the services, do the transactions that you promised, put in the investment account that you opened, and getting you activated so that you use what I have to offer. And then I want to maintain my relationship with you using various predictive models. So we see that the first pillar in the making money construct is that there are an enormous number of cases that can assist you to drive more intelligence in getting customers closer to you and not having to. And that means decision-making optimization and process robotic automation that many companies have implemented. You want to be able to see, are there ways in which you can use AI to make this, providing a large part of that promise for us. And maybe just for the sake of time, then in the third pillar is what we call protecting money, and that is dealing with anomaly and any kind of fraudulent activity over time, classical or my traditional AI methods, just to determine what it is that is fraudulent or what is not happening the way that it's supposed to. So I think that executives really need to think about it across, all the pillars and keep it a systemic issue. It's not just about client service or about singular problem solving capabilities.
Cool. Your internet's a bit patchy, unfortunately, at the moment, Jay. So we'll see how that pans out. Maybe there's a magic solution. You can ask some bot to go and solve that. With this incredible technology, I still don't understand why our internet lets us down, and when we switch from 5G to some sort of wireless, we always have to go the way. Someone should solve that, shouldn't they? They really should.
Yeah.
So that's one example. I like that phrasing, by the way. So making money, saving money, and protecting money. That seems a good way to look at it. What is the problem for large organizations? For the way I look at it, their processes and their pace, their rate of change in adopting these technologies seems glacial. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we've set up this course. It seems to be unbelievably slow. Now, a startup, we've got a question coming through. I maybe ask about that context as well. But startups like yours, for example, are able to go and use the latest technology, spin it up incredibly quickly, with limited amounts of money, and literally piggyback on these technologies and go from idea to product in the space of months. And for some examples, it's even coming down to weeks and even potentially days. One of the forecasts that I heard was that we are probably in the next year or two going to see the first individual billionaire, as in they've come up with an idea and built a company using AI, but they've not employed any other people. They've been able to construct it just with their own hands on keyboards or voice to prompts. which would be absolutely outstanding. So, what is the problem for these large organizations? And actually, is this a battle they can even compete in?
Listen, I think that the overall way that you should maybe reason about this is firstly look at the organization as a risk managed environment. And I think that any of the very big companies that we look at, big banks, big telcos, they all sit with exactly the same challenge that I think that you don't really experience in a startup that provides services to these companies. Because if you make the tiniest mistake, you will be held accountable for it. So that means that you want to make sure that the options that you exercise are really the ones that are going to have within the risk framework that you've put in place, executed. So what we're seeing is that companies are creating skunkworks, adjacencies, alternative projects to test many concepts in isolated and in controlled environments. So that means that there are controlled experiments happening, all over the world. I was looking at some stats from a report that was published by Google and a few companies in the last few months. And we're basically seeing that it seems that about 99% of the world's middle tier and large organizations have already got some form of traditional AI in production because it's explainable. So if you have a regression or some kind of model, you know that you can explain why it has done what it's done. And that means that if a customer phones you up and say, well, why did you not give me the loan? You can explain to them and you're not going to get into trouble with your regulator because you were doing things without knowing why it's doing that. And that is probably the biggest scary element, I think, of many of the AI models. Because if you had to think of a generative model for a moment, and the difference between generative AI and discriminative AI, if you had to take a model training process and you take data that you already generated in your business and you turn it into a model, and all that a model is essentially the use of an algorithm applied over and over and over again to find a score that you can take data that you've never seen and apply it against that. Right. So in a discriminative model, if I want to do face detection on my phone, I don't need a generative model for that. I need the model to tell me, yes, this is my face or not, and I open my phone. If I take my fingerprint, if I take my biometric, that means that you need high degrees of preciseness. You need to be accurate in the moment. When I want something to be novel, I use generative means. So that means that the model needs to generate the next plausible token based on a cost and a score algorithm and then produce an output that sounds good. The problem is that's not good enough. We don't want things to sound good in banking or financial services. We want things to be accurate and precise. So that's why you see that in a large organization, the experiments that are running that we are at least tracking and that we know about, companies are grappling with that. They say, well, if somebody hacks my bot and they use linguistic hacking because now it is a language model, and I get it to give me a recommendation that is completely outside of the guardrails of the organization, how am I going to prevent that? So that means that I need to put it through its paces. And putting it through its paces means that I've got the architectural committee, the tech selection committee, the compliance committee, the risk management committee, the digital exposure committee, the client interface committee. All of those have to approve the fact that have you considered the angle that I've already tested historically. And that, I think, is what's slowing down some of the cases. But I don't see a stoppage or any slowdown in the experiments. I'm not seeing a slowdown in companies trying it out. What I am seeing, though, is that companies are incredibly scared of putting, let's say, a generic generative model in front of customers, but they will use it for the employees, but they know they got controlled conditions. And I think that just deciding on all the moving parts is a pretty tough thing to do. And one of the things that we tackle, you're talking about our course, one of the things we tackle in the course is say, well, what would your framework look like? What are those elements that you want to consider when you go through this decision-making process? Because it's not just something that you're going to do out of the box, let's get access to it. Because the startup, to flip back maybe just to that, sorry, I'm giving you a long answer here, Colin, but the startup, you focus on solving a point solution. You're trying to be relevant in a very specific focused area. So you can innovate and get something to market pretty quickly. But by the time it gets used, you have to really have a deep understanding of its contextual use. And that is what then creates a very different situation where it then is going to impact people's lives or financial situations.
So what do you think leaders need to do apart from going on this course? The the steps that they've got to go and take to try to go and speed up, this process. Because I've got this feeling that, um, well, it could be a couple of things. I don't know what your experiences are. It could be a lack of knowledge. It could be fear. It could be this kind of awareness that you don't know where to start and you don't need to go and ask. It could be that you've got a risk framework where you look at your organization systemically and you apply that model, and that's not working in an AI-driven startup model, and you don't have enough branches and test cases and little experiments going on outside of the organization. It could be that you're not doing enough corporate venturing. It could be, but these are just my observations. Where do you think they're being held back, and how do they overcome that so that they can do these experiments at scale?
I think if we go back to the three areas that we mentioned earlier, if you had to think of client interfacing and I want to create a better way to communicate with my customers, the historical way was to create an entirely standardized conversation. And that means that I treat all my customers the same. Dear valued customer, please participate in this. So we're definitely seeing that in outbound or in inbound communications, where that the risk of you getting a word wrong or a phrase wrong within the guardrails that you provided won't make a financial impact or a risk to the organization. Those cases can go through a fast track process where that you can get those cases implemented and have control groups where that can get to market. And that's what you see even with the Klarna scenario or other companies like those, or Citibank's chatbot or people like that. You're trying to control the situation so that you can immediately recover. But as long as it doesn't give advice, make a promise, affects a person's physical, kind of existence from a financial point of view. Where it exists, and let's take maybe just the opposite end of that scenario. If a person is really deeply affected by something, and that you're not going to give them a loan, or you're going to deny their mortgage, or you're going to take a company's debt finance and reject it or approve it based on a model, then you need to think about things very clearly. So what we find, the way to accelerate it is to create digital twins. So the digital twin concept is pretty well known in the industrial world. So that means that you have an AI that runs in parallel with a human making decisions on the way, and you use the human to calibrate it through augmentation. And that's one of the kind of primary principles that we've seen people apply to get accelerated cases implemented. And that means that the AI is the augmentation, and the human sitting in the framework of your existing organization's legal structure and compliance structures still complies with what it needs to comply with, but it uses the AI to assist it in showing what its decisions would have been or its actions would have been, and you can then use that to calibrate models later on. So I think that there are various approaches that you can follow, and obviously they all lead to some kind of outcome, and that means that serving my customers better, driving my bottom line, protecting the money that I have for my customers that are already in my base. And if you satisfy those, then you should be able to get the benefit.
Great question here. Thanks for that, Jay. Great question from Bakari. I think Bakari. You remember Bakari?
Yeah.
We can't forget Bakari. And to everyone else that hasn't asked, please do put questions down if you've got any. I'm going to change it ever so slightly. It says he's starting up a partnership and Monday.com, but the real crux of it is what should he be thinking through to build up an AI-centered culture? And I think that's something which a lot of people, especially data scientists, seem to forget, that the numbers and the math and the models are all very exciting, but if your culture isn't data-led in the way that you think, you don't have a hope of actually getting a hold of these latest tools and doing anything at pace and scale and getting the budgets that you need to go and do things. What's your take on this idea of culture, and how do you actually get it running so that people want this stuff?
I mean, listen, that's a tough question, because I think that culture, and especially the large companies that we've been working with, is an incredibly personal thing to most of them. It's an executive's, or a team, aspiration that is essentially manifested through all the decisions and actions within the organization as a whole. But to kind of sideline that for a moment and then mapping it back to culture, if you had to think of just how the AI world is really layered, maybe that's one way to think about what data-led, analytic-led, prediction-led, whatever that kind of phrase really means. What we don't realize is that if you're in the financial institution, you are already pretty au fait, and you are already pretty ingrained in using data, even if it's in a spreadsheet all day long. So that means that when you speak to a customer and you want to get any evidence of what they've done historically. You want to give them a loan all the way through to take the investment. You would run the numbers, and they might have been done for you by your technical team, but you are already fairly data oriented, and that's at the base layer. So we see that most companies already have an enormous amount of data that's unharvested. They've got an enormous number of analytics sitting on top of that data. And we often call those Pizzas and Manhattans. So you've got pie charts and bar graphs, and it essentially describes everything that's going on in your business, but you have no idea why that pie chart moved from 6% last month to 10% this month. And this is where the next layer comes in. The next layer then says, well, if I want to start understanding the why, and I now apply predictive analytic, now what I want to do is take the data that I have and see what evidence I can extract from that to see if I can make decisions in the moment or in the immediate future based on the lessons that I've learned historically. And if I use that, it will then give me evidence that the reason why my chart is moving is because there's a process not working, there are customers not signing up, there are things that are going wrong, and I can get to the root cause of why things are actually happening the way they're happening. Then the layer above that is the true predictive capability. And that means that can I start creating predictions that are medium, longer term to tell me what the actions are that I can take to make my life better? And for the sake of time, the layer above that is intervention. Can it make the decision for me without me being present, and then tell me that it's made the decision to make sure that the chart does not go from 6 to 9, but it stays at 6 to 6.5, if that was, let's say, like whatever, a churn number or whatever it might have been. And that is the thing that at the moment scares, I think, a lot of people. It's a bit like the self-drive car, because the self-drive car's analytic is looking at the dashboard, seeing a pie chart being your speedometer, and you can, decide if you're going to go over the speed limit. If you're in self-drive car mode and you put it in conservative mode, it does everything for you. You don't participate. You are the participant in its, in this its transportation capabilities. So I think that by the time banks think about that, your culture then gets mapped onto this to say that who will I allow to make decisions based on predictions versus who will I allow to make decisions just based on an analytic that is data. So that complicates it, I think, because it seems to be, maybe for many people from the outside, a simple thing. And sometimes for us who are not day by day inside a large bank, but the people inside really grapple with this, I think, because, if you have a prediction and it says that you're supposed to take a certain action and your gut says that I'm not going to do this, what do you think they end up doing? And I've experienced this day by day. In actual fact, every single day of my engagement with large clients, I hear the story. The spreadsheet said X, I did Y. My prediction said X, I did Y. That means the human in the system still decides, I go over the speed limit and I'll take the risk. If it's an intervention, the AI does it for you and it takes the risk. And humans are not quite there yet. So I don't think cultures are quite ready to say, I will allow an AI to make a decision on my behalf.
I'm sure we're going to get there relatively soon. I mean, the guy holding the red flag in front of the car, eventually he knows he's going to get run over, doesn't he? How do you actually think you should structure it in a large organization? Because I guess you've got that perennial debate. And the last 10, 15 years, certainly I can remember, there's always this sense that you have to centralize technology. It becomes a big cost center and they start controlling everything. And that was bad enough when technology moves slowly, because you're sitting there in the business wanting to do something. No, we can't get it done until the strategic architects has had a look, and we've introduced this massive ERP platform, which of course it will be in June, and it's never in until, it might be June 2028. And so you've got this continual battle. Some of the best work I've ever seen is under the table, and people are just running things and getting on with things, not illegally, but perhaps it's not formally approved for the normal governance processes. And I see this as an area where this fight is now going to go on to absolute steroids, because if I'm sitting there in the business, I want my AI people next to me. I don't want them hived away in some dungeon and in front of technology. What's your kind of take on how people should structure this, or how they are structuring it at the moment?
I think it's very much a networked, way. Well, it answers it some way in the fact that it's a networked. The network is being the answer. I can maybe describe it like that. So that means that the people who are central needs to deal with the generics of the super platforms. So that means that you want to have a core capability. So if you centralize capability and you decentralize business benefit, we see that there's some ways in which you can really harvest that strength on all levels, because that means that you don't want a team that sits in a line of business who, let's say, deals with outbound or inbound clients, and then an opposite team that deals with risk and compliance issues, and another team that deals with process optimization, have exactly the same core platform that they have to start implementing from the ground up. I don't think that's practical at all. And actually, even the companies that we've seen that are highly federated have made decisions to centralize at least some of their platform cloud interfacing decisions so that they can enable the teams on the edge.
Mm.
So if the AI move to the edges, it just means how far that edge is. Because what's kind of it turns out that in the cloud world, AI apps have become one of the great modern phenomena, if I can use the word phenomena carefully in this context, in that if you know that a specific app that you can get from an Azure or an AWS or a Google Marketplace can solve a specific problem for you, why would you want to go through the entire data science, data engineering, hypotheses, get an entire team of people that start from the concept all the way through to all the steps that you need from machine learning engineers and production engineers and ML ops engineers and DevOps engineers and getting into production if you can get something from a store that can already solve the problem for you as a service? So we are seeing that this uptake of the service to give me a jump start is what often then comes in from the edge. Because for the center, it needs to deal with enterprise level issues. But the person who sits in the line of business, who really needs to make sure that their P&L or their risk profile scoring or whatever it is that is their primary KPI or KPI set that they measure, can be kind of assisted with by using AI, then why would you want to put them through a central structure to make those decisions? And that's kind of the way that we're seeing it playing out. So that means that this more networked view of how AI projects get deployed is probably going to become the big next wave if we just take the current observations.
Which kind of opens up another question in terms of whether businesses should be focused on taking if they're still hosted, should they be moving 100% of their data sets onto the cloud now? Is that a no-brainer, or have things moved on where you can be hosted cloud, multi-cloud, and it's not actually so important anymore?
Listen, I mean, that's a very tough question, Colin. And I think that we debate it with customers every single day. So it turns out that small language models that are used to produce certain kinds of output that you can host on your own infrastructure are in some cases far more accurate in producing useful output than using a large language model that you buy as a service from public companies. So there could be cases created, and we are seeing companies creating these cases where they run them entirely on their own infrastructure. And in some cases that is cheaper depending on what the volume is, access to expertise, and various other elements. So I'm a bit scared to kind of venture into giving you an answer that's universal. But I definitely see that the hybrid model is very, very much alive. And the hybrid model means that I want to have control over certain things. There are certain regions, and we know that in some countries that we're operating in, that you are not allowed to put the data in any data center if it's going to leave the sovereignty that it's kind of generated in. So that means that you cannot allow it to go to the cloud anyway. So that means that this hybrid approach is pretty much alive. Companies like ours who are in a startup world, whatever, obviously our preference is that you just buy it in the cloud and you access it and you consume it and it makes your life easier. But that's not really what clients worry about, because if you start looking at personal identifiable information like PII and all those kind of, that means that you are very, very worried about a public cloud company leaking or exposing any of that data, because they're all constantly under threat, where you have no control over some of those. So I definitely think that there are some ways that we need to think about.
I'm the CEO. This is an analogy. I'm not the CEO. I'm the CEO of my own business. That doesn't count. I'm the CEO of a large financial organization. It could be insurance. It could be anything you want. I'm sitting out there in Saudi. I've got a problem. I know that this is, a massively important topic, but it's a very complex one. How do you go and get started? I'd like to think I just go and employ the right person, CEO of AI, head of AI, in the same way that Microsoft have got hold of someone like Mustafa Suleyman. But that's the thing, because when you look at Microsoft, you look at Google, you look at Amazon, AWS, and so on, they've got lots of people that are deep knowledge experts in these fields. Their whole businesses are based around using technology like AI. They've been doing it for over a decade. they've been in the progression. I think the large language models was a massive shift, but pretty much everything else they know about, and they've been working with and building and researching and working with Stanford and other well-known institutions to be at the forefront of tech. If
Sure.
I'm running a bank or I'm running a life insurance company, I've probably not been in that space. And now things are moving so quickly. Where do I go and get started to actually try to go and catch up and put myself into that space where, if I'm not market leading, at least I've got to be a bloody fast follower?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a continuum, if you just had to think about it for a moment. On the one end of the continuum, you have the institution that wants to, and its core intent is to manage many of its own inventions. So that means that they often engage in employing digital strategists, and they employ programmers, and they build a lot of tech themselves. Even though they might purchase some technology, they are deeply engaged in creating some kind of technological output that is specific to their business. And that's their view of how they think they can be competitive. The opposite end of the continuum are the companies who say, well, if we are a financial institution, let's stick with our knitting, stick with the thing that we're really good at, and let's not build anything, because that's not really how we compete. We compete on customer service and on financial product or financial instrument design or various other drivers. And I think you really have to take that into account. And I think we've learned, even as a business, and in the last probably 6 years or so, we've learned pretty hard lessons around dealing with companies on both ends of that spectrum. Because if you deal with an institution that, let's take the one that wants to do its own thing, you have to provide it technology that is sufficiently incomplete so that you can provide it essentially a journey map for the technologists. That means that the technologists, the data scientists, and the technically minded business people to stay excited about producing an outcome that they know that they can control themselves. And that means that you need to provide smaller level of components and pieces of technology that they can go do things that they want to do themselves. That's why the Python module system and the like has become so incredibly popular, and why it's been driven into a lot of data science communities in almost any institution, is because you got control over the outcome. So that means that on that end, the way you start is you're going to need somebody that at least know what the use case is, what the core skills are that you need to get to an outcome that is practical. On the opposite end, you have the reverse. You know what your business is doing, but you want to be enlightened by what the new possibilities are. So that means that your AI person or your leader, your technically minded business person, is somebody that wants to tinker. And actually, the language tinker popped up in a lot of our New York conversations, where people say, well, we have people that tinker. And what tinkering does, it allows somebody to say, well, yes, I think that this is a possibility. Now, let me get a professional who can sell me a product or can do it for me, that will implement it and get the benefit that I require for my own situation. So I think that in both cases, you're going to need somebody that at least leads some capabilities, that will integrate it with the rest of the organization. And there is a kind of a phrase that has emerged, and that is this thing called the technically minded business person. And we found them to be the most practical and essentially most effective in corporations in getting AI projects to market. Because if you have a pure technologist, you need a very special kind of technologist that hardly ever ends up in a bank. They normally end up in technology companies, if that is your primary job. Where if you end up with somebody that just wants to do science, that means run experiments continuously, nothing ever gets productionized. And that's why we look at the rate of failure in many larger institutions in the financial services sector. It is because people will keep on testing and trying and experimenting, and never got to a point where they make a decision. If you have a business person who can say that now you stop and you now implement, and I want to see the result, and then iterate, you sit with a different outcome. And that means that the team itself doesn't have to be your team. You can augment that with various skills from different capabilities for companies who specialize.
Okay, I promised that we'd leave 5 minutes just to talk about the course, and I've obviously completely messed that up. I always do. We've got like 1 minute or less. To close out, can you tell us a little bit about this course that you're running this 3 days over in Saudi? I'll share the screen so that people can just see the pop-up. Who's it meant for? And what are they going to get out of it if they were to attend?
Okay, so the basis of the course is really a culmination of the lessons that we've learned over the last many years with Henley and other programs that we run around the world, and feedback that we got from executives in institutions that we've worked with. So taking that into a journey, the idea is to start with understanding why and how the decision-making is being affected in the organization and the tooling that comes with that, tooling as in decision-making hooks, dealing with case studies and really practical implementation areas, and then dealing all the way through to understanding how the immediate future and some of the changes coming down the line will affect your business. So the idea is that you will walk away with essentially a toolbox of items that you can go and apply in your own business that is basically usable in your own setting. It's not going to be something to say, well, this is the only way to do it, because what's happening in the AI space is that there are many, many open-ended, solutions to a lot of these problems that are being solved. And we will present what the alternatives are and some of the ones that we've seen work and don't. But at the end of the day, you'll have a set of tools and a set of capabilities that you can then go and apply when you go back to the office.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone that's dialed in. Thank you for anyone that's watching this at some point in the future. If you've got questions, then wherever you're getting a hold of this, you're probably going to be able to reach out to me on my email. Find me on the World Wide Web, that thing that still exists before we go and change all of this. Obviously, maybe that's a topic for another conversation for another day. Just search for my name, Colin Iles, or Dr. J. Von Zell. Look for the Financial Academy. Go into Henley. You'll find us one way or another. Thank you very much. Wishing you a lovely afternoon and a fantastic week. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Colin.